Great. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for giving me this platform. I offered to give this talk after hearing several sessions ago people throwing out ideas about conscious machines. And so this talk actually is one of my lectures in my course that I teach at Ben Gurion University to engineers. It's the only humanities class that they take, so it's quite fun for me to be able to teach them about ethics in AI. And so this is my course, Ethics in Big Data and Artificial Intelligence. Just to give you a quick overview, I know many of you have heard when I presented myself the first day, but for those of you who didn't hear, I'm really an engineer for over 35 years. I worked for small companies, big companies. In the end, I worked for a small company that became a big company known as Mobileye. I helped design this chip, which is basically powering the autonomous vehicle revolution. It's in over 200 million cars doing precursors of autonomous driving. But with all my interest in solving puzzles and debugging and writing code, I always had these questions about the big questions in life. Why are we here and how are we to live? And that brought me to look into my Jewish roots. And in the end, I became a rabbi. While I was designing chips, I went to this Jewish seminary, a yeshiva, and became an Orthodox rabbi, but that still wasn't enough. And so I went back to school and I got my PhD in Jewish philosophy at Bar-Ilan University, where I combined all of my interests, and I wrote my doctoral thesis on the moral status of artificial intelligence. Basically, how are we supposed to interact with entities that look like us, act like us, speak like us, and then really the big question for tonight is have consciousness like us. And that brings us to the question of consciousness. What exactly is, what exactly is consciousness? So consciousness gives us a lot of faculties, a lot of capacities that other entities in the world don't have. The first thing is it separates the animate from the inanimate. That is to say, consciousness is what allows us to have pain and pleasure, to experience emotions, and that we need for empathy and to be a moral agent. That was an idea put forth by James Moore, where he talks about there's 4 types of moral agents. The top 2 being an explicit ethical agent. What that really means is an autonomous vehicle. It explicitly executes moral, ethical ideas, but it really doesn't have any idea that it's doing so. Only full ethical agents, meaning human beings that have consciousness, can make meaningful moral judgments. And then that brings us to the third aspect, is what it really separates us from animals. Animals also have consciousness, but whereas animals have sentience, human beings have sapience. We have second order thinking as opposed to animals that have first order thinking. I always like to give the example of a steak. If a dog sees a steak, it sees a steak, it thinks steak, I'll take it, I won't take it. That's about as far as it goes. People, on the other hand, see a steak and they can think about all kinds of other things related to the steak. They can translate the steak into a monetary figure, and then they can start thinking about that in terms of their personal economy. They can translate a steak into a function of climate control. There's all kinds of ways that people think about thinking. People think about feeling. Animals do not have that higher order capacity. Even though both share some kind of, like we said, sentience, basic consciousness, but not second order, and not second order phenomenal consciousness, where we can experience phenomenon in the world and think about that in multiple levels or orders. And then finally, John Searle, who passed away just last week, is famous for bringing this idea through what he called the Chinese room. Basically, he demonstrated through his thought experiment of the Chinese room that machines process symbols and human beings process ideas. We work semantically as opposed to syntactically. Basically, what that means again is that we experience the world. At the end of the day, phenomenal consciousness is what allows us to experience the world. So with that understanding, how are we going to get machines to do that? So, before we get to that, so I just wanted to make this one sort of historical point, and that is, what's the difference between a soul and a mind? And so John Locke is the one who first put forth this idea of a mind. The word may have been around, but he basically applied it to philosophy of mind, to the idea that basically consciousness is the perception of what passes in a man's own mind. So what he's really saying here, he's saying that we experience the world in our minds. The consciousness takes place in this metaphysical entity called a mind. Now, John Locke is the first person to do this because coming on the heels of the Enlightenment period, everyone was trying to remove the discussion of souls and religion and talk about things in a very sort of cold academic way. And so the mind really is a replacement for the soul. There is no difference. As a matter of fact, if we take a look at this quote from John Heil, who wrote in his classic textbook on the philosophy of mind, in the introduction, he says, "I have used the word mind here, but Plato and Aristotle speak of souls. One question you might ask is whether mind and soul are synonyms, or whether minds and souls are in fact quite different. Although we nowadays use mind and soul more or less interchangeably, it is likely what the Greeks meant by soul is not quite what we mean by mind. Talk of souls has moral and religious overtones missing in talk of mind." So basically what he's saying is that indeed souls and minds are identical, except for this one little aspect, which is the religious overtone, the idea that we can talk about the eternity of a soul. We don't talk about the eternity of a mind. We can talk about the reward and punishment of a soul. That doesn't exist when we talk about minds. So as I said in the beginning, John Locke basically coined this term to remove the religious aspect. But if we are really talking about minds, we're talking about souls, at least in the aspect of this metaphysical entity, which gives us all those capacities that we just spoke about in the previous slide. And there's other quotes. Somebody mentioned Ted Peters on this talk. So Ted Peters also has written about this. And he says here, the Greek word from which we get our words psychology, psychiatry, or psyche can be translated as either soul or mind. And so basically, before the Enlightenment, everybody, when they wanted to talk about this metaphysical entity in human beings that feels and experiences the world, they said soul. After the Enlightenment, they say mind. So basically what we're trying to do is build a machine with a mind, or if you're religious, with a soul. And then the question is, so how do we do that? So just to sort of cut to the chase, there are basically three primary approaches. There are others, but these are the main ones. The first one is infocentrism. They concentrate on information processing. The mind is largely and in key ways computational. So what infocentrists say is we need to build a machine that mimics the way a brain works. If we can get the brain to be mimicked by a machine, the consciousness will emerge from that sophisticated computational model. There are others, physiocentrists, which say not quite, because what goes on in the brain, it's true that it's all these transistors switching, but it's not just about switches switching. These are special switches. Neurons have electromagnetic fields. The brain has a whole physiology around it, and we need to mimic that. So if we can build a machine that performs like a brain and has the physiology, these electromagnetic fields like the brain, then consciousness will emerge. And then finally, there's the third group, the biocentrists, and they say, no, you're missing something, because if you look out at the world, the only entities that we know have consciousness have biology. So if you want to build a conscious machine, you need to use biology as the substrate. And there are many labs around the world working on this. There's a thing called organoid intelligence. A guy named Sergei Paska at Stanford Labs has a wonderful TED talk on it. Unfortunately, we can't watch even a clip of that here, but that's the idea. So once we say that we're going to build conscious machines, and these consciousness is what we said before, it allows us to have higher order thinking. It allows us to have experience of the world. We can now understand and feel the world. If we build a machine like that, so what would the moral status of this machine be? Well, I think phenomenally, therefore I am human-like. You'll forgive me of completely destroying Descartes' wonderful little saying, but at the end of the day, you understand. If a machine can think phenomenally like we do, it can experience the world, pain and pleasure, empathy, meaning. So you have basically created a human being. And so then the question becomes, I mean, why are we building these machines? So the question of why to build a machine and why would we build a conscious machine can be answered by the greatest industrialist who built the great machines, Henry Ford. And he said, for most purposes, a man with a machine is better than a man without a machine. Right? That's why we build machines. We build machines to help us do our work. And so I would say that today engineers are adding to that and saying, and a man that is a machine is best of all. That way we can just take ourselves out of the picture and have our machines do everything. If you could build a conscious machine, you don't need a human being to do that work. And so conscious machines have been called in many, many places the holy grail of artificial intelligence. Hod Lipson, who's the director of the Creative Machines Lab at Columbia University, said this. He's working on building conscious machines. A conscious machine is bigger than curing cancer. If we can create a machine that will have consciousness on par with a human, this will eclipse everything else we've done. That machine itself can cure cancer. So that's why we want to build conscious machines. And then the question becomes, so why not? Why wouldn't we want to build conscious machines? So here we have a machine that's going to figure out for us how to cure cancer. What could be wrong with that? Well, we just said that these are conscious beings. They have feelings, emotions, drives, wants. What if they don't want to study oncology? What if they don't want to cure cancer? So you could say, look, I mean, if it really is conscious and it understands the value of curing cancer, that's such a noble thing. So it would also become convinced, like any human being, that they would be saving the world. And so we could convince them that really this is a great thing to do. So that's wonderful for the noble robots. But what about all the millions of other robots that we design for what are known as the 3Ds of robotics? Dull, dirty, and dangerous work. We've basically built modern slaves. Slaves, they're not just machines, they are beings with consciousness, with a mind, with a soul. And we have built them to do our work. All of a sudden, this holy grail isn't so holy anymore. So everybody agrees with that. And, we don't want to build slaves. We don't want to design slaves and make slaves. So then the question becomes, and I think this is really quite relevant for our group here in the Family Network, what about children? What about friends? What about making perfect robotic beings? So that question has actually been posed by several philosophers that are based themselves on amazing, interesting, I would say, paper in 2001 from Julian Savulescu. He writes about what he calls procreative beneficence. Procreative beneficence basically means we should be selecting the most perfect child that we can bring to the world. We want to bring the best life possible. What parent could argue with that? Of course, we want to have the best life possible for our children. So here, there's really nothing novel. What becomes novel is that Julian Savulescu says that we should select the best children. He says Now that we have the technological capacities of IVF and PGD and all the other great things that will allow us to select and design babies, we are morally obligated to do so. That's what he claims. There's many people who have written against him, but in the 2020 or 2018, 2019, a guy by the name of John Danaher, he's a big ethicist, philosopher in this field of AI. So he writes that, okay, we can't force women to go through all of these procedures like IVF and PGD and everything else. They're expensive, they're painful, they're difficult. You can't force people to do that. However, now that we can build conscious robots, we can fulfill the idea of procreative beneficence and build the best life possible for the next generation out of robots. We will make conscious beings ourselves, designed for the best life possible. So I would like to argue against this, and I like to do so from the Jewish tradition. That's my shtick, is I try to find paradigms within the thousands of years that Jews have been grappling over moral dilemmas and apply them to our modern dilemmas. So for that, I turn to what's known as the golem. For those of you who aren't familiar, the golem is basically a synthetic humanoid. You take some dust, you make some letter permutations, you make some incantations, and you can create a being. Did this happen or it didn't happen is not relevant. What is relevant is, what are these stories about conjuring synthetic human beings telling us about making synthetic human beings? So if you go through the literature, there's a professor by the name of Moshe Idel. He wrote a book called The Golem, where he goes through all of the literature. And going through his book, you can see that there are actually three types of golems. There's one that has chiyut in Hebrew. That basically means it has a life force. We could say it's a philosophical zombie. It doesn't have phenomenal consciousness. It doesn't have pain and pleasure. It doesn't experience the world. It's ChatGPT on legs. And then there's the next one, which has a nefesh, an animal soul. It has first order phenomenal consciousness. It can feel, but it can't really do more than animals can do. And finally, there's one story in all of Jewish literature that talks about conjuring a human level conscious being. So that's really what we're looking for. So let's take a look at that text. So the text is as follows. It's found in a manuscript from the Vatican, number 299. It's dated circa 9th to the 11th century. And it goes like this. There was a guy named Ben Sira, and he wanted to study the Sefer Yetzirah, which is known as the Book of Creation. Like I said, it tells you letter permutations and can help you to create a being. A heavenly voice came out and said, two are better than one. And so Ben Sira went to the prophet Jeremiah, who was his father, and they studied this book for 3 years, following which a man was created for them, and upon whose forehead it was written, Hashem Elohim Emet, the Lord God is true. It's a quote from Jeremiah. And now in this golem's hand, there was a knife, and the golem was erasing the aleph of the word Emet. So the word emet means true, and without the aleph in front of it, it means met, dead. So in a sense, he was scraping off this aleph, and instead of the word saying true, it said dead. He was, in a sense, killing himself. I put a little asterisk here. Gershon Shalom, who's a famous academic Kabbalist, wrote about this, and he said, it is indeed significant that Nietzsche's famous cry, God is dead, should have gone up first in a Kabbalistic text warning against the making of a golem and linking the death of God to the realization of the idea of the golem. So already here you begin to see that this isn't so positive what we're doing here, trying to create a conscious being. But let's go on with the parable. So Jeremiah cried out to the golem, why are you doing this? I mean, we've spent 3 years trying to get you. So the golem answered, I will tell you a parable. There was a man who was an architect and wise, such that when the people recognized this, they coronated him king over them. He knew so much more than them and had so much more capacity than them that they made him king. In time, others came and learned the art such that the people left the former and followed the latter. Similarly, God looked into the book of creation and created the world such that all the creations coronated him king. Now, when you came along, says the golem, and made a man, me, as God did, what will be in the end? They will leave God and follow you. So basically, the argument is being made here is that if we create conscious beings, people will become atheists. Now, this argument may have been good in a time when there weren't so many atheists, but maybe that isn't really such a great claim that we should stop technology because people will stop believing in God. In any case, I mean, I don't know how much we would stop believing in God. God created the world and everything in it from nothing, and we'll be creating something from something. But in any case, that's the claim, is that people are going to leave God. They're going to leave the whole idea of religion and follow the AI. They will leave him and follow you. And he who created you, what will become of him? So Jeremiah ben Sirah said to him, if so, what can we do? The golem answered, reverse the sequence of letters used to create me. They reversed the sequence, and the man became dust and ashes. So this story is clearly saying that we should not be creating conscious beings. But I think that there's another also very powerful story of golems. It's actually the first golem story in Jewish literature. It's found in the Talmud. And it says as follows. Rava, a big rabbi, said, if the righteous wished, they could create a world. So now he's made a very bold claim. If you are a righteous person, you can create a world. You could create a human being. And where does he learn that? So he brings a verse to back up his claim. Because it's written, but your iniquities have separated between you and God. It's a quote from Isaiah.
I'm
and
just
so,
going to
yes,
interrupt to say, how much do you have left? Because we're almost out of time.
yes, I'm an engineer. I timed it.
Okay. All right. Just making sure.
Okay.
I should.
All right. So what he's saying here is that what separates human beings from godly powers is sin. So if we're righteous, we can have those same godly powers at our hands. But what kind of righteous is he talking about? So Rashi, the commentator on the Gemara, says righteous means completely free of sin. We're not talking about some good guy. We're talking about somebody perfect. And we know already from Ecclesiastes that there is no such a being, for there is not a righteous man on earth that does only good and sins not. So basically, this beginning of the story already sets up the defeat of the idea. But the story goes on. Rava created a humanoid. He made himself a golem. He figured, I'm good enough. I'm going to try it. And he sent the golem to his friend Rav Zera. Rav Zera spoke to this golem but received no answer. So he realized that it was a creature from his friends. And so he said, return to your dust. So the beginning of the story says, you can't do this. The end of the story says, you must not do this. And so I believe that these two stories very much argue against making conscious beings. Finally, there's also all of the very famous stories of the golems throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, where the golems run amok. The most famous one is known as the golem of Prague. All the stories are the same. Some smart rabbi makes a golem that will help out society, and then the golem loses control, and they have to kill it, defeat it, annul it. So what I would like to say is that all of this golem literature argues against making conscious machines, whether it's all these golems that ran amok in the golem stories, whether it's Rava's golem that ends with Reb Zera annulling it, or whether it's Ben Sira and Jeremiah's human level golem that says, don't make me. And so at the end of the day, I conclude that if we're making conscious beings, we should be making conscious beings the old-fashioned way. This is my wife and I many, many years ago. Thank you very much.